Welcome to the Agents Angle, looking once again into the world of football agents, or soccer agents for many in several regions around the world. I'm Jonathan Booker.
And I'm Peter Paleologos. In this episode, we'll be joined by guests sharing their experience of working with agents from a club perspective, while also discussing the industry from their region, the hugely passionate footballing Balkans. We also highlight some news that people may have missed in relation to the FIFA Annual Law Review.
Plus, we will be examining an area where worrying conflicts of interest may arise due to yet more shortcomings in licensed agent eligibility criteria.
All that to come on this episode of The Agents Angle.
Now, this episode of The Agents Angle comes to you with no guarantees. So although we were able to avoid a certain 4 letters in the last episode of The Agents Angle, it is unlikely, if not almost impossible, that we will be able to avoid those dreaded letters again today.
Well, Jonathan, there actually are 2 4-letter acronyms that influenced part of the podcast today, especially the first part of this podcast. FFAR, FIFA Football Agent Regulations, and FLAR. However, as we mentioned in the intro, we have a fantastic guest who's covering intriguing and compelling football market in Europe for football agents to Balkans. And I promise, in relation to that part of the segment, we're going to keep the acronyms sparse for our Balkans guest.
Yeah, but the great thing is I win the bet. You said FFAR first, so there we go. And since the last episode, there's been quite a few events, which in a way have included matters relating to the football agent industry and related regulations. And as Peter said, one of those is the FLAR, the Football Law Annual Review, which was held in Miami this year, the home now of the FIFA Legal Division, and that was on the 27th and 28th of February. And the first thing to say is that this event, understandably, isn't etched in the diaries of many football agents. But I think some agents do pay an interest in the FLAR, if only to keep ahead of the curve and absorb some legal knowledge, however technical or even tedious that may seem to be. And I have to be honest, Peter, for me, I was a little disappointed with this year's FLAR. It wasn't as varied or as engaging as last year's event in Tokyo, Japan. Maybe it was the format or the topics. I don't know. But I certainly didn't watch the cumulative 8.5 hours in full this time around. There were, however, 2 presentations that I think stood out from an agent's perspective. The first was the presentation on the FIFA TMS by Laura Corica, the team lead for education, support and communication at FIFA, which although the presentation was probably more targeted towards clubs, I think it would give agents a valuable insight into what clubs go through with TMS. Because agents rarely get to see the inner workings of TMS to understand the processes and procedures that also affect them in some way when it comes to loans and transfers. But the second presentation, and the one that really stood out for me, was from Christina Labrie from the MLS, Major League Soccer. And I think her presentation really gave an insight into, let's say, the basics of how the MLS is structured and how it works in regards to aspects such as player recruitment and contracts. And there is no doubt that that would be useful to any agents operating in that market or potentially operating in agency business relating to the MLS. And dare I say, I think it actually gave a lot of food for thought in terms of how world football or soccer may look to evolve in the future, if only in just a few ways. But I'll hand over to you at this point, Peter, as my learned expert colleague in matters of football law, for what you noted from an event that does ultimately have those in the football law community as its primary target audience.
Yes, John, and I also watched a bit of the FLAR, and there were some interesting topics, bridge transfers and the FIFA rules, what you mentioned with the FIFA TMS, matching your transfer on FIFA TMS do's and don'ts, the multi-club ownership model, which interests a lot of people, the Bundesliga 50+1 rule, how does that system work in practice? Like you, I found the MLS speaker, Christina Labrie, Very informative, especially breaking down how the MLS as a single entity works, and also how MLS, and we've seen a lot of supposed conjecture or criticism about training compensation and solidarity payments, how that applies in a league such as an MLS, but she broke it down how it's working at the moment. So that was very informative. And as you said, agents can take something from that. But she also talked about transfers, especially international transfers, which are conducted directly between a foreign club and an MLS club, and how the MLS oversees the transaction. And we know recently, and this is interesting for agents, players now can be traded between MLS clubs without the need to sign a new contract because, and a lot of agents know this, but some don't, that players have a single contract with the MLS rather than individual teams. So that is quite unique. The other interesting presentation I found was by, I think it was Hrvoje Barola, a lawyer that comes on to quite a few FLARs. He went through liquidated damages clauses, sell-on clauses, and buyout clauses, which I believe, especially the latter two, are very important for agents to know in light of not just the Diarra case, but when negotiating contracts. Because in those parts of the negotiation, although the agent is not a party to the transfer agreement per se, they have a role to play in those negotiations in negotiating the price, the sell-on price or the buyout, because that is very important for their clients. And very interesting presentation from the technical point of view, and I would recommend, although it's a bit dry, something to look at for agents if they get a chance. The third presentation is one from FIFA and related to a lot of the European Court of Justice cases. Jan Kleiner from FIFA, he talked about Diarra, the Super League case. But the one I'm interested in, which he mentioned briefly, especially from the agent's perspective, is the German agent cases, all that affect the FFAR. We haven't got a final decision. And what he said was the importance of FIFA's rules. They need to meet a test at the European Court of Justice, that these rules are transparent, objective, non-discriminatory, and proportionate. Those four words, in FIFA's mind, are very important to the way this FFAR cases are going to go. So quite an interesting presentation, a little bit technical there by FIFA, but acknowledgement that the FFAR is a big case, as has been Diarra, as has been the Super League.
As you said, there was a lot of reference to Diarra at the FLAR, which is understandable as it had such huge ramifications for so many, including agents. But there was very little reference, although you mentioned it, to agent regulations and the case or cases at the ECJ regarding the FFAR. And in reflecting on that, I don't think that was any real great surprise. Emilio Garcia Silvero, FIFA's chief legal and compliance officer, in his introduction, which was between 30 and 40 minutes, he referenced FFAR for just 2 minutes. And then the presentation on day 2 with Jan Kleiner, FIFA's Director of Football Regulatory, which you mentioned also, his presentation was again around 30 minutes, but again, he also spent approximately 2 minutes on the FFAR cases at the ECJ. So are FIFA being reserved and showing a considerable amount of discretion until the AG's opinion from the ECJ is released? Or is FIFA being somewhat cagey on the topic of agent regulations? And ultimately, is this a sign that confidence is waning just a bit at FIFA on the matter of agent regulations and the FFAR? The thing is, we just don't know.
Don't know, but the outcome of the Diarra had a big impact on FIFA, and obviously the RSTP having to change an article or put interim measures. The same thing could happen with FFAR. We'll get that decision. However, from FIFA's perspective, you don't want to say too much publicly. You don't want to antagonize any courts or judges or any parties. Like all lawyers, and FIFA's got its own legal department, and you mentioned Mr. Silvero, Mr. Kleiner, they're both major FIFA lawyers. They would avoid comment until the Advocate General decision is made in relation to these German agent FFAR cases, if I call them that. Not even the FIFA Agents Working Group will make much comment about these cases in a direct way, so it's a waiting game. And this sort of leads to something like we may need to invite someone from FIFA to give some update as to what FIFA does after the Advocate General's decision or before. And that's something we will look at this podcast because I think that's important. We need to get a bit more from FIFA, Jonathan.
Personally, I think Emilio is probably the only person who can somewhat definitively answer these questions. He has been inextricably linked to the FFAR for many years now. It's part of his role. And it's safe to say he can probably clarify things on FFAR better than anyone else at FIFA. Even Gianni Infantino, for that matter, whose vision is arguably the central motivating factor behind the FFAR. And at this FLAR, which is an event I understand is very much of Emilio's creation, going back several years now, there didn't seem to be, well, for me anyway, such strong rhetoric on agent matters that I think it's safe to say we have heard from FIFA on agent related matters and the FFAR for several years now. And in essence, I think FIFA have done themselves a disservice in how they've communicated on FFAR matters over what is now many years. But just going back to the FLAR, I will just go through a few things I noted in regard to the FFAR and those few mentions it got. Firstly, the acknowledgement by FIFA officials that there had been a lot of domestic cases. Then a comment on FFAR at the ECJ being that, and I'll quote, "It is difficult to predict what is going to happen." We then also had acknowledgement, albeit possibly jokingly, that FIFA are going to Brussels more and more often, reflecting to all the European law-based challenges. And then specifically on FFAR itself, that I will quote from a FIFA official, that FIFA are trying to do certain things that certain groups don't like. That's life, and we understand that. Which for me did hark back to a bit of that FIFA rhetoric and a demonstration that they still don't accept that this is the majority of agents who reject FFAR on some of the main key points. And to somewhat flippantly state that's life shows me they don't truly understand the effect this has on people's livelihoods and lives. But above all, the one comment that really struck me was in terms of what would happen if the ECJ ruled against FIFA on FFAR. And that was, and I will quote yet again, "We, meaning FIFA, will adapt and pass new regulations to be fully aligned with the ECJ ruling." So is that the first clear sign of FIFA anticipating possible defeat over FFAR at the ECJ? As in several years now, I have never seen or heard any sign of FIFA considering they may lose and thus have to change things. Who knows? Because as we said, FIFA are rarely communicating openly and clearly on such matters, let alone answering questions openly.
Interesting you say that, because we've got another FIFA agents exam coming up, I think just after the AG's opinion in these German FFAR cases, European Court of Justice cases. Look, FIFA will respond to the court's decision, the European Court of Justice, just they did with DIARA in relation to termination of contracts and those issues. It may be changing the FFAR or remodelling it. It also comes down to, is FIFA going to remain the entity who still issues the football agent's license? If it's a yes, then it will regulate, but in accordance with what the European Court of Justice finds. So they may have to change. The challenge is also how any FFAR going forward is going to work with, you mentioned domestic cases, Jonathan. What's happened in courts like in Brazil and Spain? There's not just the German cases, so it's more complex web. Also, we've had the arbitration in England, which caps can't exist there. We know that in China and Australia, you can't have caps generally. So it's going to be a bit of a mix of a system. And of course, Italy and France have got their own licensing systems from a statutory perspective. It's a wait and see. Will it be a reset, a rewrite, or just a rewording? But one thing that we know, that just like the ARA, also the Super League case had some interesting principles that talked about the importance of competition of law in sports. I think at the end of this, FIFA, and not just FIFA, but other regulators will be wary that judicial review is available under European Union law and courts can look at things, and therefore that's going to have an impact on the FFAR going forward. We'll know the flavour of where the decision may go after the 8th of May, but it's a very interesting time for agents. The time is finally coming to clarify at least this part of the agents' regulation, especially in relation to the caps, Jonathan.
And as you touched upon, I think it's perfectly reasonable requests for an independent outlet like ourselves here on the Agents Angle to make to FIFA to get some comments. Yes, we're critical when we need to be, but we also praise the positives. And that is whether it be certain agents, clubs, associations, or even FIFA. It is always the approach we like to try and take. And as I said, given that Emilio is arguably the most knowledgeable person at FIFA on the FFAR and agent-related matters, he could offer so much clarity to us and the listeners, and he'd be very welcome here to give a FIFA perspective. And if he isn't available, then Mr. Infantino is, of course, welcome to explain this steadfast line from FIFA on FFAR and the interrelationship with his vision. And we have reached out to FIFA on various occasions, both directly and indirectly, to invite representatives to come on the Agents Angle and discuss agent-related matters. And that's not just FFAR, we will point that out. But there is a clear reluctance of many to accept those invitations, whether rejecting the invitations or just ignoring them. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's my aftershave they don't like. It's called barks worse than its bite, by the way. But given that at one event, a senior FIFA official seemingly backed out of speaking on the topic of FFAR on the same day I was also due to speak, maybe it is me. And if it is me, and more than likely something I've said, if they feel more comfortable with just you, Peter, doing an interview and asking the questions, I'm sure we can accommodate that. If only for the benefit of the listeners and the agent community to get that direct line from FIFA.
Jonathan, I hear what you have to say there. I think we will invite Emilio Garcia Silvero, Chief Legal and Compliance Officer at FIFA, to the podcast and see what happens. I've always had an independent line on everything. As a podcast, we always provide a fair canvas for every guest to put their views forward. And I think we will try an invitation. I mean, like anything, you get knocked back with invitations, but we will proceed with an invitation and see if we get an opportunity to have Ms. Silvero on for our viewers, because I think, as you said, he's probably the most knowledgeable on the FFAR implementation all the way to what's happening now with the court cases. So watch your space.
But just before we close the chapter on the topic of the FIFA FLAR for 2025, there was a really interesting interaction at the end of Jan Kleiner's presentation with the Q&A after that presentation. And that comment and or question was posed by FIFPro's senior legal counsel, Alexandra Gomez Brunevalt, who has always struck me as quite a formidable character to cross swords with. So it was little surprise that Mr. Kleiner went a wee bit pale and notably took a somewhat defensive posture when she stood up to ask that question. But the point she made could be taken as related to an agent's perspective in a way. And I would very much like your opinion on these, Peter. Firstly, she raised the point of a CBA, a collective bargaining agreement, which is something we have discussed on a few occasions now relating to football regulatory disputes. Although for me, from my basic knowledge, Mr. Kleiner seemed to have a rather contorted view of what a CBA actually is. Maybe I misinterpreted what he said. But off the back of this, she said, when referring to FIFA and FIFPro, and I will quote, "We need to negotiate now, not consult, which is the position of FIFA." And then asked, why is FIFA not willing to negotiate? And yes, this was off the back of the topic of Diarra, but those comments about meaningful consultation and a need to negotiate could quite easily have come from the mouth of someone representing agents' views and agent associations on the topic of FFAR, rather than players and the Diarra case.
Yeah, I observed the questions that were made by Alexandra Brunerwood from FIFPro, as you said, quite high-ranking official from FIFPro. We know that FIFPro represents players just like us agents do, but obviously from a different angle, a different perspective, more collective, more union, and looking at those sort of bargaining rights and protections. I will say this, having been part of the engagement, not for the longest period of time with FFAR before it came on board, I did know that FIFPro also, whether they were consulted or part of the engagement, they were part of the engagement for FFAR. They also have a seat at the FIFA Agent Working Group's table, which means for me, they are engaging about FFAR and what's important for them and their members. And they have been consulted maybe to some degree. And I make that clear because some of the sources that I've had, that they were part of the submission to have the contract, the representative contract between an agent and a player for 2 years, not 3. Now, it was 3 years in one of the versions of the FFAR, one of the draft versions, but it ended up being 2 now. Maybe they lobbied for that, but that would have been engagement. Now, what Mrs. Brunerwood's saying now is they want negotiation at the table. So they want action items to be taken. It's no longer maybe consultation or engagement. But going also, she mentioned collective bargaining. And being in Australia, we have a collective bargaining agreement. So that's an agreement between the league, the clubs, the players union. A lot of the collective bargaining agreements also have salary caps. So MLS has got one as well, and also protecting players' rights, obligations, and all that. I think at the international level, collective bargaining agreements, especially a PAN framework, is a bit harder to implement. And I think that's where maybe young Kalina got a bit confused between engagement and collective bargaining agreements, because not all countries have collective bargaining agreements in football. And we also got to understand one thing. In football, not all players are employees. In many countries, there are 2 other aspects. A lot of countries don't have strong players' unions, or what, like we like to call them, PFAs, who are members of FIFPro. And number 2, and I know this is the case in the Czech Republic, and it's in other countries as well, players are seen as independent contractors, not employees. So that also has an effect on whether you can implement collective bargaining. I would say that FIFPro, obviously after the Diarra case, they're also very concerned with a lot of the competitions where players are playing too much football. There's a lot of hot issues. You mentioned Emilio Silvero bringing him on. I would also like to see how FIFPro, what exactly is their position on the agents framework at a more clearer level. Yes, they've given snippets, but I want to see their full policies and submissions or views on where the FFAR should go, especially after the European Court of Justice cases. But interestingly, Jonathan, there was a FIFPro legal conference recently. And I'm referring to an article, it was from earlier this month, that football legal experts gathered for the FIFPro legal conference. And one of the people that spoke at that conference was Senior Legal Counsel Alexandra Gomez Brunerwood, who looked forward to this conference as one of the special occasions on the FIFPro calendar. Now, that conference took place at FIFPro House in Hoofddorp. This annual event's opportunity for player union legal counsels from around the world to update themselves on domestic and international issues, and also to bring in industry experts to provide specialist analysis on a wide range of topics affecting players. And from an agent sort of perspective, what interests us in this conference was, of course, the Lozana Diarra case. Very much key learnings were outlined about what should happen after this ruling, and FIFPro Legal Director Hrvoje Mia spoke about that. The future of international sports arbitrations. We know the Court of Arbitration of Sports, its jurisprudence in football matters, may be challenged by national or European courts. They also discussed, and I would love to be a fly on the wall, Jonathan, the FIFA agent regulations. And also it was a chance for networking and learning best practices, broaden everybody's, I suppose, networks and supporting members in the best possible way. So would love to see what the discussion was on the FIFA agent regulations. But as I mentioned before, we need to get that FIFPro perspective going forward, especially after the ECJ ruling, or maybe even before, Jonathan.
Yeah, the FLAR itself, there was pretty common knowledge that that was happening. It was widely promoted and it was also streamed online and for free. Yet sadly, that wasn't the same case, it seems, for the FIFPro event, which I personally didn't know about until a few days before. Plus, it wasn't streamed online, to my knowledge. And personally, I would have been quite interested to listen to that FIFPro event, because FIFPro, in many ways, is shrouded in somewhat mystery in some aspects. And, you know, it's difficult to get answers on those key points. However, we, like a lot of agents, differ in our personal opinions when it comes to the likes of FIFPro and then national affiliate player associations. But for me personally, I think the agents and the agents associations and our industry as a whole are probably more closely aligned with the aims, goals and interests of players and the player associations than anyone else in the football community. not least as FIFPro and the PFAs are supposedly there to represent the best interests of players, as are arguably many agents. Plus, it's worth remembering that FIFPro are represented on the AWG, the agent working group at FIFA, for whatever value that brings, as the jury is very much out on the AWG for me at the moment. And ultimately, some of the comments and frustration coming from FIFPro representatives in regards to FIFA are very similar to that of the agents with the FFAR and other matters over a lack of adequate consultation and effectively often being arguably railroaded into regulatory changes.
Yes, interesting points you make, Jonathan. Now, the first part of our podcast today, it has been very top heavy. I'll say the FLAR and FIFPro's view on a few things. However, it's time to pivot. And our guest, although he's also a lawyer, he's at the cutting edge of football in the Balkans. And he provides an important club perspective of the agents world in dealing with football agents in the Balkan region. He provides insights from that region, and he's a very interesting guest. Over the years, many football players from the Balkans have stood out for their flair and creativity. Today, a significant number of Balkan stars, whether lining up European football or emerging as promising young talents, have their roots in the academy systems across the Balkan region. And where there is top football talent, there is also a thriving network of football agents. To explore this compelling, passionate, and dramatic football landscape of the Balkans, I'm excited to introduce our guest, Hrvoje Čabraja, Head of Legal of Croatian club Lokomotiva Zagreb. Hrvoje is an international sports lawyer with a decade of experience in football administration and recently analysed the FIFA Football Agents Report, breaking down key statistics on agent fees in Croatia and also players across the Balkans. He has completed the ISDE Global Masters in International Sports Law and has also completed the FIFA Executive Arbitration course. Additionally, Hrvoje has mentored and trained several aspiring football agents to prepare and pass FIFA Football Agent exam. Hrvoje, welcome to the Agents Angle.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me here. I'm looking forward to having this discussion with you.
Yes, the Balkans, being originally from Greece, although I live in Australia, is very close to my heart. It's a region that encompasses a lot of different nationalities. Football is a passion, huge clubs. Most of our listeners will know the big clubs from the Balkans, from different countries. Just in terms of the Balkan football landscape, it has its own unique culture and complexities, even among neighbouring countries. From a club's perspective, in terms of your position, what are the key challenges they face when dealing with football agents in the region?
Well, I would say that the key challenge for the clubs in this region is actually related to the budgeting, because most of the club's main source of revenue is actually transfer money, which then results in high levels of insecurity within those clubs. Therefore, clubs' sporting policy is actually heavily influenced by their transfer policy. This is something that the agents in the region are well aware of, and well, I would say are using it for their own benefit, meaning that once an offer for the player they represent is received by the club, these agents ask for a very high percentage of the transfer fee because they know that the clubs are not actually in a position to refuse any offers. So this is something that has been going on in the region for years now. If we move to the FFAR era, following the introduction of the FFAR, then I would say the main issue at the moment is that some agents are still unlicensed or not eligible to be licensed and are still working as agents, entering into agreements with the players and also asking clubs to issue mandates or conclude agreements with different persons who are not actually involved with deals, but are connected to those agents that are without the license.
Just in relation to the transfer market in general and comparing it to those transfer markets further west, whether it be France, Italy, Spain, England, within the Balkan region, there's a lot of nuances between the countries themselves. So I wonder if you could highlight a couple of those differences and also the main differences between the region and those more Western markets.
Yes, I think that what is most important here and towards what the market is mostly oriented are the outgoing transfers. So all of the clubs are looking to sell because as I mentioned previously, transfer money is very important for their budgets. As also mentioned, agents have adapted to this and have been patient and have been waiting for the international transfers of their players to actually happen. When it comes to Croatia in particular, there are some interesting agreements that the agents conclude either with the players or with the clubs. And this is, I would say, typical for this country. So, for example, in Croatia, there's still a huge number of these so-called civil contracts, according to which the agents invest in the player's development and then afterwards receive a portion of their salary in return. Typically, this happens once a player transfers to a club abroad. Also, these agreements are not entirely in line with the FFAR because they are concluded for more than 2 years period and are not typically reported to the Football Association. Sometimes these sorts of agreements also oblige the players to then, when it comes to the transfer of these players, it obliges them to use the services of the agents with which they concluded these civil contracts. Then there's also a situation in which agents conclude a representation agreement with the player that is within a club and are then asking those clubs to issue exclusive worldwide mandates to represent clubs with the outgoing transfers of those players. Sometimes even there's something similar to a TPO agreement, which is usually circumvented through a so-called success fee, via which these agents are asking for a percentage of a future transfer fee of those players. Of course, most money, as I've said, is within the outgoing transfers, and the agents are looking to get a percentage of this as well. Then finally, some of the agents never actually ask the players to pay any commission, but either get paid by the releasing club through a transfer fee percentage or arrange with the engaging club to pay the service fee agreed between the agent and the player, something that has been partially banned by the suspended parts of the FFAR.
And with all those challenges, you're able to see it from various perspectives because you work with clubs, you work with players, you work with agents, and so on and so forth. And in regards to those specific challenges from a club perspective and your role when working with a club, how can agents and how do they assist clubs in overcoming those particular challenges?
Well, when it comes to the agents, I think that what is mostly appreciated by clubs in this region is their education. So when you get an agent who knows if something is possible to do, and then if something has been regulated and not permittable, then you look to use those agents. Like you feel safe with them, and that's something that the clubs in the Balkans are actually looking forward to.
And with regards to the transfer market, are there any particular leagues or regions where the Balkan clubs prefer to recruit from or conversely sell talent to? And how do agents actually influence those relationships?
Well, when it comes to the recruitment, I think that generally clubs recruit talent from the countries in the region. So you will see a lot of Croatian or Serbian players in the neighboring Bosnia and Herzegovina and Slovenia and vice versa. So this is basically the general pool from which the talent is recruited. However, in recent years, there has also been an uprise of talented players coming from the African countries as well. But I think that this is something that is happening globally as well. Then when it comes to the transfers out of the Balkans, as I'm sure you're aware, top talent gets transferred to top leagues directly. So you've seen players like Luka Vušković moving to Tottenham in England as soon as he turned 16, and then Petar Sučić from Dinamo has moved to Inter in Milan recently. So you do have this top level of players that are moving directly to the top clubs and top leagues. However, the most common destination for most players, so not that top level, is usually second-tier European leagues like Switzerland or Belgium or Poland, Austria, Denmark as well, and the Scandinavian countries. And recently, we've seen an interest coming from the MLS as well for the players here. When it comes to the agents and the transfers of the players, it's usually connected to the network of those agents. So you will see players connected to some agents moving to the same countries and the same clubs with which those agents are connected. So this is maybe something that the agents are actually also helping the club with.
I did some research into players coming, from Croatia and Serbia and other Balkan markets, and I saw that Italy Serie A clubs love buying players from their neighbours across the Adriatic or from the Balkans. And in fact, they buy more players or transfer in more players from that part of the world, the Balkans, than the other top 5 leagues in Europe, probably by a wide margin. Now, you wrote a paper on football agents in relation to Italy and Croatia. What were the key conclusions of that research, of your paper, and how do the football agent industries in Italy and Croatia differ?
Well, as mentioned previously, Italy is a neighboring country. And of course, they're looking to bring in talent from Croatia and the region as well. Most of those players going to Italy are actually youth players. Italian clubs are using the 19.2b exception from the regulations on the status and players, the FIFA regulations, of course, trying to bring in as many talented players from the neighboring countries as possible. This happened with Slovenia as well. When it comes to the paper that I've written, this was actually my thesis at EASDAY, and this was written before the introduction of the FFAR. So at that moment, the regulations on working with intermediaries was in force. And what I mentioned in the paper is I actually advocated for a new regulatory framework and the reintroduction of the licensing system, something that has happened a few years later. My suggestion was to use Italy as a possible example because first, it's a neighboring country. And then second, Italy was one of the few countries at that moment that had their own licensing system in place within their country. I did mention that this system that Italy was using could be a bit too complicated, the double track system that they're using. So what was also mentioned is that the problem with the regulations on the working with the intermediaries was that it allowed for a dramatic number of unskilled and unqualified people to enter the market. And this resulted in, as you all know, the often mentioned Wild West in the market. So the conclusion was that re-regulation was actually necessary and that the smaller countries like Croatia will need help from FIFA to initiate such change.
Now, the former Yugoslavia, long gone now, but was once considered the Brazil of Europe in terms of player development, the talent that was coming through there. Croatia, and not just today, for the last, say, 10, 20 years, is a football powerhouse, major producer of talent, and Dinamo Zagreb have been doing well in European tournaments, while Romania and I would say Bulgaria have had previous golden generation of players, Hrvoje, Stoichkov, I won't go into too many. Greece and Turkey continue to develop top talent and also have their mega clubs, Olympiacos, Panathinaikos, Fenerbahce, Galatasaray, and that Serbia, interestingly, leads Europe in the number of under 21 players getting first league game time or minutes. In short, the Balkans is a key exporter of football talent before and right now. How do you see, Hrvoje, the future of the region and what impact this will have on agents throughout Europe?
Yeah, I agree completely. Clubs in the region actually depend heavily on talent production. The clubs invest most of their skills and effort and money in the development of these young players, as this is the area from which the main source of their revenue comes. So I don't expect this to change in the near future, to be honest. When it comes to the agents, they are all well aware of the situation and they know that the clubs are investing in the young players who are then sold to the bigger clubs and the bigger stage. And what they do is they try to get in a relationship with those players as early as possible. What we have in Croatia is a situation in which the agents can conclude representation agreements with the players as early as they turn 12, even 6 months before that, because the Croatian Football Association regulations allow the players to conclude the scholarship agreements with their clubs as early as they turn 12. Making the agents possible to conclude the rep agreements 6 months before that time. So this is something that is happening in the region. I would here like to add an additional thing, and I think that I speak for most of the clubs in the region when I say that I hope that the recent Diara ruling will not result in the disappearance of the transfer fees in football altogether, because this will be awful for the clubs in the region.
Especially considering the academies now that are developing talent throughout the Balkans. We know that they have a big track record. The Dinamo Zagreb one is a model for a lot of other worldwide academies. In terms of treatment of agents, now I know you're head of legal at Lokomotiva Zagreb. you would have dealt with both local agents, Croatian agents, or other agents from around the Balkan region, but also agents from outside. How do clubs in the Balkans treat agents from not just different Balkan countries, but also agents from outside the region? Is there any difference?
Well, I would say what's going on is that at some clubs, there are still some old school sports directors in position who are rarely speaking English. Then they tend to have a language barrier when it comes to working with the agents from outside of the region. So these sports directors would rather deal with the agents from the country or the region because the languages are similar, and they'll skip this language barrier with this. However, there are an increase of an appointment of foreign sports directors within the clubs in the region as well. And by this shift towards the presence of the foreign agents in the market has happened as well. But what I would conclude is that at the end of the day, it's actually all about the connections and the network.
You've spoken about the knowledge of agents and the awareness of them when they're building those relationships with clubs. But apart from that, from your experience, Hrvoje, what qualities do clubs value most in an agent? And how has the relationship between clubs and agents in the Balkans changed with the variations in agent regulations over the past few years?
Yeah, as you mentioned, that I mentioned previously, the knowledge and the education is definitely something that is highly valued. And the next thing is networks. This is very important, even from my perspective. When it comes to the changes with the agents in relation to the agent regulations, I think that with the introduction of the service fee cap, even though something that is currently suspended, agents have come to realize that for them, it could be more cost effective to represent clubs than the players. Because even on that table of the caps, by representing the clubs, they could actually earn more money, especially from the perspective of the Balkan region and the region being oriented towards the selling of the players. And I think that this is actually something that could become a global issue in the long run if the suspended parts of the FFAR come back in force.
And how do clubs in the Balkan region handle multi-party representation when it comes to agents? Are there stricter regulations in the region across the different countries? And do you think stricter regulations will change such things?
No, there is no stricter regulation in the region on this, and the multi-party representation is heavily present in the region, as we discussed previously, because the agents that are representing the players are also representing the clubs that are selling those players, because as we mentioned, this is where the actual money for their commission is coming from. I do believe that the stricter regulations, like the ban on dual representation, which was established in the original FFAR, could bring change. But at the same time, there will also certainly be ways to circumvent these regulations. And the agents tend to get very creative when it comes to the payment of their commission.
Certainly creative. I think everybody involved in a transaction gets creative at one point or another. And with regards to the regulations and those changes, and also the uncertainty, because we don't know which way it's going to go, everybody's got their ideas. How are agents and clubs and others in Croatia particularly adapting to the agent licensing situation at the moment? And what is it like on a national football agent regulation level? Is that very different?
Well, at first, back in 2023, most clubs and agents did not even know of the new regulations. A very small number of them, of the agents from the region, actually sat the first exam. However, little by little, the agents have become aware of the licensing requirements and the regulatory framework. So now we do have like a very good number of agents with the licenses, and the clubs also very much aware of what's going on within the regulatory framework. When it comes to Croatia, it does has its own specificities in relation to the agents regulations. One being already mentioned, the possibility of concluding a representation agreement with the player as early as he turns 12, which is not that common in the global market. Then the next thing is that the reporting obligation is not suspended in Croatia, meaning that the agents here are obligated to report any agreements they conclude or transactions in which they are involved to the Football Association. Also, unlike the currently suspended FIFA Agents Chamber, Croatian NDRC does have jurisdiction to adjudicate on the agents' matters, and the disciplinary committee also can sanction regulatory infringements, which is both from the club's and the agent's perspective very useful. What could also be useful, especially for agents, is the information that the Croatian NDRC has recently also been recognized by FIFA, meaning that this body can decide on cases with an international dimension. So, for example, a German agent representing a Croatian club in a transfer of its player could give jurisdiction to the Croatian NDRC to resolve possible disputes. And I think that this could be very useful and helpful for the agents while the agents chamber is still suspended.
Now, given your legal background and the introduction of the FFAR facing many challenges from around the world, some of those which are on hold at the moment, and we believe waiting for the ECJ ruling, are there any potential legal challenges in the Balkan region and Croatia that may arise from the introduction of FFAR that we will see in the future?
Well, to be honest, I doubt that any legal challenges will arise in the region. And the main reason for this is that there's no agents association here. The agents are not that close connected to one another. So I don't think that they will start like an action against the regulatory framework at all.
Hrvoje, there's a lot of non-Balkan football agents who are interested in players from Croatia, Serbia, Romania, Turkey, Bosnia, Greece. I can go on and on, of course. And Slovenia as well, developing a lot of players. We see a certain striker and a goalkeeper that's top level. What advice would you give non-Balkan located football agents on how to deal in these sort of countries? Do they need certain knowledge? Do they need to work with a local agent? Do they need to have particular skills? Or any other advice you can give for anybody who really wants to work with talented players from the Balkan region?
Sure. I would say that the most important thing is to never forget that this is the selling region. And by bringing a good offer for a player, that would be something that would be more respected than bringing in a good player. So bringing in offers is very much respected. Also, as you mentioned, knowing the right people opens many doors in the Balkans as well. So connecting with the local agents could work. Also, maybe connecting with former international football players that have a very good status in the region is also something that could help. So as already mentioned previously, networking helps greatly.
I know from experience, especially in Croatia and Serbia and other Balkan countries, that agents play probably a stronger role in the player's pathway and development than maybe agents in other countries. And what I mean by that is they help sponsor the player, support the player, even financially or the family due to circumstances, and really have more of a hands-on role. Is there anything from the Balkan region that you see in agents that could emerge and go into more into the international sphere in terms of the international agent market? And also, is there any unique, I would say, approaches to player scouting or even use of data or even tricks in using in terms of contract negotiation that you see in the Balkans that may also spread out to other markets?
Well, when it comes to scouting, clubs in the region actually use agents heavily for the player scouting because most of the clubs do not have their scouting departments and are outsourcing this to the agents or the agencies. So this is something that is used heavily in the region. When it comes to contractual negotiations and interesting stuff going on around contractual area, I've come to realize that there's this new approach that some of the agents are using and is closely linked to a concept of bridge transfer in the sense of the FIFA RSTP. So what some of the agents are doing is actually bringing a player from one club to a club to which they are closely connected just to sell those players from those clubs abroad, because that way they can actually get a much higher commission.
We have a final question for our guests. Usually we ask our guests if they had one wish for the football agent industry, what would it be? But Hrvoje, with your background, being legal and being a club, having the club perspective and experience, we're going to vary that question and ask the following. In regards to the regulation of football agents from a club and legal perspective, what do you think clubs would like to see changed, be improved, or even be implemented to improve matters for everyone involved?
Well, I think that the FFAR in its original form actually helped clubs in the Balkans greatly. Because first, by the introduction of the service fee cap, as we discussed previously, this way less money would be handed to the agents and more would be kept by the club, even though, and also mentioned, everyone would then get more creative with ideas for the circumvention of such cap. Then the dual representation ban, something we also discussed. There would be less conflicts of interest that normally in this region lead to lower transfer fees. Another interesting thing that could help clubs is the client pays rule, which was also introduced with the FFAR, as I believe that most of the players are not at all aware of the amounts that their agents are earning and charging for their transfers. This way we could get more transparency. Another thing that was good with the FFAR, and this is still on, is the possibility to remunerate the agents that are representing the minor players. I believe that it's only fair to have such possibility, especially from the Balkan club's perspective, as the agents do help and invest in the development of young players together with the clubs in the region. And finally, licensing system and the CPD requirements helped greatly. You can see agents have more knowledge of the things that are happening in the market, and especially the legal background. So yeah, this is something that helped greatly and that I believe that will help in the future as well.
Hrvoje, thank you so much for coming on to the agents angle. Thank you for your insights, providing the club perspective, providing sort of the background and nuances in Balkan football, in particular Croatia, also the region generally. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to discuss these topics with you.
Admittingly, Jonathan, I am a fan of Balkan football. My roots are from Greece, my heritage from Greece. Hrvoje provided great insights into the Balkan football agent practices and business and how clubs deal with them, because our emphasis here today was the club perspective, someone who deals with so many agents from the Balkan region. I would like to give my own small insight into Balkan football, having dealt with agents over the years as an agent in Croatia, Greece, Serbia, and Turkey. So I have a little bit of experience. I will say this, on a general level, the future looks bright for Balkan football with many young talents emerging and clubs now more than ever investing in development. World-class benchmark regarded as the Dinamo Zagreb Academy, very well regarded. Partizan Belgrade on the other side in Serbia are also very focused on their academy, but it's also in Greece. We see Olympiakos and PAOK, and also in Turkey, which we've seen Arda Güler and Yunus Agun, fantastic Turkish youth development players who are part of that nation's football resurgence. So there's a lot going on in the Balkans, and it's an exciting time. Although, as we know, there are very passionate football fans, especially at the games, but we won't go into that. That's not about the agents. I will say a couple of things, some anecdotes about the Balkans. I'll start with Turkey. In terms of Turkey, is an agent commission a tax-deductible expense for a player? No, unlike other countries. So beware of that. We know there's been research about due payables, and we know there's about 400 listed as owing money to players. And unfortunately, and as we say, the positive stuff, there are some negative stuff in the Balkans. There's quite a few professional contracts that are unpaid from clubs to players in Romania, Turkey, Serbia, and Greece. So as an agent, when you are dealing with all clubs, but also with the Balkan region, you need to be aware that there is sometimes an issue there about players getting their money. So do your research. We talked about the Court of Arbitration of Sport. Funnily enough, a Greek court recognised an award to an intermediary. This was before the agents regulations came in relation to a Court of Arbitration of Sport CAS award. So CAS awards can go to local courts. We didn't talk too much about Bulgaria, but the player and the club right now have the right to pay for services of sports or football agency. We know with the FFAR, there was sort of this try to limit clubs paying unless you're a club agent, having the player to pay. But there are, at least in the Balkan region, in Bulgaria, both have the right to pay. The other interesting thing is we know the players change nationality so they can play for other countries. I'll give an example of some other countries that I haven't mentioned. Albania, 30 players have changed association, and also Bosnia, 22 players have changed. This was in 2021, so quite interesting. Just some final observations in dealing with the Balkans. The Balkans is now a lot about younger players. I talked about academies. You will find a lot of Balkan agents, and I'm generalizing here, of course, but a lot of the agents watch at the training grounds. They monitor what we call the chosen ones, the young talent players who they believe will go on to a career internationally. Now, players are getting, I suppose, transferred younger. We know from the Brazilian experience where Brazilian players used to go a lot to Portugal, maybe to Holland. Right now, a lot of the big European clubs are signing Brazilian players at a very young age, 18, 19, straight away. The same thing is going to happen in the Balkans. We're seeing a lot of young players, even from my other country, Greece, quite a few young players are coming through and are being earmarked by big European clubs. So it's becoming sort of that Brazilian flavour in the Balkans. And one last thing, I think we mentioned it a few shows ago, but I will reiterate that Serbia had the greatest share of outgoing transfers with a releasing club agent. So very much an export market, and that signifies the Balkans.
Yeah, and that interview with Hrvoje, it was one I really enjoyed, and he shared a lot of valuable knowledge that I'm sure will be of value to many agents and others. And he came at it from a very open, constructive and practical viewpoint with his observations on the agent's world. And it's worthwhile pointing out again that this interview was with someone primarily an official with a club and their perspective. And the first one I wanted to touch upon is something that we've spoken about in past episodes. And I think it's also something that has rung alarm bells for many years. And I think something we and others raised with FIFA during the very early stages of FFAR. And that's this apparent loophole of agents potentially being able to secure very long-term mandates, if not rep agreements with clubs. And FIFA seemingly didn't listen to those concerns. And this, as Hrvoje points out, has huge ramifications. And whilst we're on the topic of oversight with FFAR, another strikingly obvious oversight in how the FFAR has been structured, whether it be down to the cap or club mandates or something else, is this concern that many have highlighted, including ourselves and Hrvoje, and more agents will likely focus more on being club agents rather than player agents. And again, this is something we've tried to point out to FIFA for several years now in terms of FFAR. And ultimately, the risk of a lack of adequate player representation from agents. Is it something which FIFA don't seemingly want to listen to, or really just don't understand? And finally, something I think we're going to come back to in a future episode is the inconsistency in regulations between various territories. And just one of those instances from our chat with Hrvoje was the age at which players can sign a professional contract, and thus also when they can sign a representation agreement with a licensed agent.
Yeah, some very, very interesting points and observations, Jonathan. Yes, I've already explained a lot of things very eloquently, as you said, but the way people can understand it, it was pitched right where people need to understand some of the FFAR and the frameworks that are in place and the effects. We talk about effect, the implications of those rules and how it affects the industry. So very, very good analysis. And just briefly before we move from the Balkan topic, which is close to my heart, Jonathan, as you know, maybe my voice changes because I get excited, but I just want to mention for our listener agents, just go through a short list of who are the big agencies doing deals in some of the big Balkan leagues. Very briefly, I get most of this information from Fax Consultancy. I'll start with Supersport HNL League, which is the Croatian First Division. And I'll go for the big 3-4 agencies there. Murray and Sistich, done over 16 deals. Greenfield, 12. Love Players, 11. In terms of foreign agencies, the English VPA Sports International has done quite a few deals. Germania Sports Agentur has done some deals. And a company from Spain, Niagara Sports Company. And we even see a big German company, Rogon, actively in Croatia. I'll move on. The best represented agencies in the Super League in Greece. Cosmos Football Agency done a lot of deals at the top. Pro Sport International and Sports Action. They're the big agencies to look out for. Rogon's done a lot of deals. The Germans, so obviously bringing players in. Another company is Sports Connection, who've done wider thing. And then move to Serbia now, the Serbian Superliga. The top agency there is Family Football. Then we've got Talent Development Agency and International Sports Office. And then a Montenegrin agent's quite active in Serbia, Igor Glusovic. We haven't talked about Montenegro. And another one is Friends and Football LLC. So fascinating there. A couple more just to finish off. The Turkish Superliga. We know the big clubs from Turkey and who are the best represented agents in that market. And I'm talking about agencies mainly. Foot and Ball, Future Ball, and Mex Football are probably the bigger agents. And then we've got Melis Yazidi and FF Sports. And there's a mention of Wasserman in the top 10. So we're looking at a big agency doing deals there. And I think that's about it, actually. But I will mention this. There is some information about the value of national team squads of various Balkan countries. And we see Turkey, Croatia, Serbia, Greece, and then now Slovenia all have big values on their squad. So I just thought I'll go through quite a few agencies. But some of the names are really, really interesting. I'll leave it at that.
But Hrvoje is one of those guests who comes to us from very much a professional background in law. But we've had no one who reflected a club official's position until now. So maybe the next target on the list for us to speak to here on the agents angle, from a club perspective, a sporting director. Not least as they are inextricably linked to agents, and most probably nowadays the people who have the most dealings with agents from within a club.
Yes, Jonathan, and I wish we could get one of these, especially the first person I'm about to mention as a guest. And I'm talking about Zlatan Ibrahimovic, who thought about becoming an agent. And the second one I'm going to talk about is Deco. He closed his player agency to start work as Barcelona's sporting director. But I'll start with Zlatan Ibrahimovic, who is now a Redbird advisor, but he admits in this article that he thought about becoming a football agent before accepting an offer from Redbird. He obviously has got a crucial role in Milan, and he spoke in terms of his career, and he wanted to be part of the Milan project. But he admitted in this article that he had a chance to become a football agent. He loves the big challenges and he likes to feel the adrenaline, the pressure. And he mentions his opportunity to enter as an agent from Mino Raiola's company, God rest his soul, Mino Raiola, and to become an agent after Raiola passed away. But eventually he decided to become an advisor with Redbird. So very interesting what Zlatan Ibrahimovic was thinking in terms of becoming an agent. And it's interesting that he also mentions he doesn't have an office. He believes that a desk is not proof of effectiveness. And that's a very interesting observation to make. I will move on to Deco. Deco actually went into agency. The former Portugal international, he closed down his player agency to work as Barcelona's sporting director. So if you're a sporting director or technical director, you can't be an agent, of course. He made that announcement on Instagram, stated that his agency D20 Sports was going to cease its activities related to the career management of football players. He did 8 years, I think, of agency and had some great partnerships, dealt with a lot of players and partners. And he represented players like Rafinha, the Barcelona winger who had to find a new agent. Now, this is quite interesting because we are seeing the crossover between agents and sporting directors. That's an interesting angle that maybe we need to look at in terms of the agent's angle going forward in terms of the guests.
Now, I've never had the pleasure of meeting Zlatan Ibrahimovic, but from people who I've spoken to, it appears that he would probably make quite a good agent. Although he does seem to have a tendency to be quite frank, if not blunt at times, which isn't always a good thing for an agent. But I don't think you can deny he's got that incredible self-belief. Had an agent for most of his career who was viewed as one of the best deal makers and agents in many ways. His playing career wasn't short of controversy, but from that, he can pass on those learned experiences to player clients. And without doubt, he has a phenomenal profile, image, influence, and is widely respected in the football world. But personally, I can totally appreciate why he chose the football executive route as a senior advisor to Inter over becoming an agent. In hindsight, if I had the choice, it certainly would be the path that I would have chosen over being an agent. So no surprise for me that the likes of Zlatan and Deco chose that path.
Yes, and we did talk about the Balkans, Jonathan, and Zlatan Ibrahimovic originally, his parents are from the Balkans. And there's a mentality in the Balkans, especially Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, all those countries that a lot of young players, their only option is the pathway of footballer. That's why the strong mentality. That's why they're working hard to try to make a better life himself. It's not as in some other Western countries where things can be very comfortable for young footballers. In the Balkans, you really got to have a strong mentality, and that shows when players go overseas. And I've already mentioned a lot go to Italy and all those countries because it's not just their talent, but the strong mentality. And Zlatan, although grew up in Sweden, played for Sweden, has attributes of that mentality for sure. Now, there's one other article that I didn't mention, but it is Edu Gaspar, whose exit from Arsenal as a sporting director. Now, this has a bit of an agent's twist to it. Edu departed, which was a surprise to many because he has a very good relationship with Mikel Arteta, the coach, the manager of Arsenal. He moved on, and this was based on speculation, I assume, because of transfer frustrations and also some connections. Edu has a long-standing relationship with influential agent Kia Hrvoje, is what the article says, who represents top players in football and may be part of his departure why he left. Now, I'm not sure, this is speculation. We know Hrvoje brought talents like Carlos Tevez and Xavier Mascherano to West Ham, and is a friend and business associate of Edu since the playing days. In fact, he helped broker Edu's contract at Arsenal and also some of the other transfers that related to Arsenal. Now, Edu was considered a future CEO at Arsenal, but seemed to be, I suppose, frustrated the limited spending in the recent transfer windows, and in particular the last-minute loan move for Raheem Sterling rather than securing some bigger name forward. That's what the article says. But he's moved on, and he's connected now with Evangelos Marinakis Group, who's the owner of Nottingham Forest and Olympiakos, another Balkan club I mentioned earlier. And Marinakis has offered Edu a role in his multi-club network, which could see him earn a bigger salary and overseeing operations. So that's interesting that this move has been made by Edu. Is it because he was working with an agent but Arsenal couldn't fulfill certain deals? I don't know. But for Edu, he's got a great opportunity under the Marinakis multi-club model. And this is an alignment sometimes we're starting to see that certain football directors will work with certain agents. We've always talked about preferred agents and relationships, and this may be an example of that, although this article could also be speculation.
Yeah, we can't underestimate that close alignment and the comparison and the relationship between the likes of sporting directors and agents. But it does create risks and concerns when it comes to a conflict of interest, even if only a perceived conflict of interest. And as we discussed on a few occasions away from the show, this leads me back to the matter of agent regulations and eligibility requirements to be a licensed agent, and something I raised with FIFA officials during those early conversations over FFAR, and also is a matter I raised with the FA in England many years ago. And the first time this matter arose for me was quite a few years ago when an official in the FA's own agent department left the FA to go and work for an agency, and actually took the ill-informed decision to use his FA email address to send an email to all FA agents announcing the fact. Understandably, his superiors weren't too impressed with this, and neither were many agents. And following that, there were a lot of unconfirmed rumours going around that people connected to the agency that he had joined had surprisingly accurate knowledge of the terms of their rep agreements with clients and when these agreements expired. Now, I do have to point out that this was never proven to my knowledge, although some sources I take to be pretty reliable. But my point here is that apart from the exclusions as to who is eligible to become a licensed agent under FFAR, whether it be based on a criminal record or similar factors, we need to see an element of protection from a conflict of interest perspective based on football roles in the immediate past. Whether it be an official with a football authority or football governing body, or even the likes of a sporting director or a manager or a head of recruitment with a club, we can't have former club officials or officials from the likes of FIFA or a national association immediately being eligible to become a licensed agent, as they may be privy to sensitive information such as details of a player's contract or their representation agreement with an agent. And this is why when I first raised this with the English FA, I think at the time I was General Secretary or a board member of the AFA, the Agents Association in the UK, that I suggested back then, and did so on several occasions thereafter, that the FA consider having a restricted covenant clause in FA employee contracts so that they cannot go on and become an agent for a set period of time. It wasn't meant to be a barrier to them indefinitely, but whether they did implement that or not, I don't know. But given their lack of concern or urgency at the time, I severely doubt they did. And likewise, in the period since 2015, we've had many people resigning from club roles, whether it be directors of football, managers, academy staff, scouts, to become intermediaries under the previous RWWI. They then relinquish their intermediary registration and go back into a club role. And a few did this not just once, but repeatedly. Now, accept this may not be as easy now with the way the FFAR stands, but as I've said to you and others, I can see FIFA's next step with an online exam from the sitting this year, being that the exam can be sat at any point in the year. Because with an online exam, there's no real barrier to not having a specified exam date. Plus, it would seemingly mean increased sittings for the exam and thus more exam fees. But if we're going to restrict people on eligibility requirements based on their relatives and in terms of current club interest or even some criminal, financial or business aspect from the past, shouldn't the regulations stop this potential conflict of interest in the agents world for those who have recently left arguably conflicting football roles? Not least as even in the age of FFAR, we have seen FIFA officials leave FIFA to become licensed agents. Plus, there are quite clear rumours that others closer to agent affairs at FIFA and other national associations have or are still considering that switch to being an agent. Now, I'm not saying the people in these positions should be barred from becoming agents, but there should be some cooling off period after leaving those previous conflicting roles to negate occasions where there may be a potential conflict of interest. Because if you have someone who leaves a club with a knowledge of player contracts or a member association with knowledge of representation agreements, is that right and just? Or do we all have a problem collectively?
Jonathan, I do like the idea of a cooling off period or gardening leave. Restrictive covenants is a bit difficult because we've seen the courts don't like anything that's too restrictive from allowing people to be employed. However, anyone who leaves a club, whether they're a football director or official, they all have to respect the privacy information from that particular club they left behind. That is apparent now. Non-disclosure agreements could be the solution. But what I've seen in a lot of clauses from employment contracts, that the intellectual property and other privacy information, including information that relates to individuals, in this case player contracts, there's clauses in the contracts which are very prevalent that stop people from publicizing or taking that information with them. So there's a lot of contracts now, especially in the last, say, decade, where people who leave clubs cannot take important information or intellectual property with them, or information that is restricted, including players, what they're getting paid, etc. So there is some protections, but I agree with you that maybe we need a more robust system to not allow for insider information or someone gaining advantage. Now, it's been a long show and it's time to sign off and farewell. I'll just mention a couple of events coming up. The Football Forum, the Agents Association, they're hosting an event with the Polish Agents Association in Warsaw on the 25th of April. It's an agents symposium. Just recently, the European Football Agents Association getting together with Esquadra Abogados and LAFA Abogados, both law firms, to hold a conference in Madrid on the 27th of March, 2025. It's about regulatory, legal and structural challenges in football, especially about this transfer window coming up. There is also a conference on the 21st and 22nd of March in 2025 in Paphos in Cyprus, and that's the Total Sports Summit 2025. It's bringing key figures from Europe, Saudi Arabia and Latin America. Representatives from football clubs, football federation agencies are turning up to that, some big names, so look out for that. And finally, the World Football Summit's Women's Football Week is on. It's in Bilbao, between I think the 24th and 30th of March, and it's about women's football and the growth in relation to that part of the industry. So quite interesting for a lot of agents. Now, please look at our LinkedIn. If you've got any questions or you want topics covered, we've actually said that we're interested in bringing some other guests from FIFA or FIFPro today. But if there's any other guests you want to hear from, please get in touch with us. That's the end of the Big Balkan show, although we did focus on some other important topics, but it's bye from me.
Well, that episode was a lot less painful than the last, albeit a bit heavy at times, if only for the fact we were not consciously avoiding those dreaded 4 letters. But no doubt in episodes to come, FFAR will be uttered a fair few times. And who knows, the invitation to FIFA to come on here and offer their perspective on FFAR moving forward may just be accepted. But in terms of the ECJ, it would appear to be out of everyone's hands now, both the agents and FIFA, and the countdown is on. With just 53 days until the scheduled publication of the Advocate General's opinion on the key FFAR case at the ECJ, well, that is from the time this episode of the Agents Angle is available, we'll just have to wait. But you don't have to wait that long until the next episode of the Agents Angle, which will be out in just 2 weeks' time. So until then, please do take care and bye for now.
The purpose of the Agents Angle podcast is to provide news, information and facilitate discussion on regulatory matters, policies, business trends and issues affecting football agents worldwide. The opinions and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only and should never be considered legal or professional advice. Furthermore, the views expressed by guests are their own and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Thank you for listening.